to page Yud Daled 14a yesterday, but we're in the middle of this complicated Gemara, actually towards the end of it. And I shouldn't say it's so complicated, but it goes a little back and forth. And it talks about the laws of Tumah and Tahara. Tumah meaning laws of things that are potentially able to become impure. And even if they're not a vessel or food, there's also a means that they might fall into another category called yodos, a handle. And our Gemara comes up with this idea that sometimes a handle for food might have certain laws that are different than other types of handles for vessels or vessels themselves. In other words, the laws of handles are they become an entity of their own almost, where they don't necessarily fall into the same rules as the laws of vessels that are impure or food that's impure. And that's what we see, but that's what we come to in our Gemara, where we're dealing with, if you want to go down to the bottom line, what we're dealing with is if something is considered a handle for food, is there any way that if you're not using it anymore as a handle, would it lose its category of being a handle? And how does that done? Is that done through doing an action? Do you have to do something to it to make it lose its being in the category of a handle? Like, do you have to do an action? Or is it good enough to think of it being used for some other purpose that it will no longer be a handle? Again, so we're dealing with the laws of Tumah, things that are susceptible to be Tameh. And those laws apply for regarding a Sukkah, because the items that you're allowed to use for schach on your Sukkah have to be items that are not fit to be susceptible to Tumah. So food is fit to be susceptible to Tumah, to impurity. Therefore, food would not be eligible to use for schach. And what we're dealing with is, what about the handle of food? Meaning, let's say you have grapes. So the stem of the grapes is considered like a handle to the grapes, because you hold the stem and you hold the entire cluster of grapes from the stem. So that stem would also be considered susceptible to impurity. However, a branch normally wouldn't be susceptible to impurity, because a branch is exactly what you're supposed to use for schach. But if the branch has dates at the end of it or has figs at the end of it, so then part of that branch would be invalid for schach, because it's a handle. It's a handle for the fruit. And so the fruit's not good for schach. The handle is not good for schach. The branch would be good for schach. Again, so we're dealing with the two opinions in the Gemara about the handle when it comes to grain. And I'm just going to go, let's go over each part of the Gemara now outside. So we have Reb Abba in the name of Rav Huna and Reb Menachem in the name of Rav Huna. Reb Abba talks about a case where you're harvesting grapes in order to press them for wine. In that case, the stem is totally not of interest to you. It's not a handle, because you don't want to hold the stem. You don't want the stems there. In fact, the stems ruin the grape juice or the wine, because they suck out some of the wine when they're, when the wine is
I don't know if it's me, but everybody froze.
Can anyone hear me?
I think we're back. I think we froze. Everybody, we froze for a minute.
Okay. So the opinion of Reb Abba was, the statement of Reb Abba in the name of Rav Huna was that if you harvest for grapes, for pressing, for wine, so then there's no law of handle. Now, that makes a lot of sense, and everyone is going to agree with that. Why? Because the stems by a grape, when you're pressing for grapes, and I don't know if any of you ever made wine, but basically you don't really want those stems there, because the stems absorb the wine. So there's no concept of having a handle. In fact, it's detrimental to the wine. So when you are boitzer for gas, when you're harvesting grapes for the press to press it and use for wine, there's no law of handle, and therefore, if let's say some impurities, something impure touched the stem, it would not cause those grapes to be impure. It's not used as a conduit to make the grapes impure, and it itself doesn't become impure, the stem itself. So basically, there's no concept of a handle. It's no longer considered. It's not considered a handle, and that would be because you're using it for wine, because you're pressing these grapes. Now, Reb Menachem statement is a little different. He talks about using something for schach. What are you doing? You're harvesting grain. So you're harvesting a piece of, let's say, the straw with the kernel, grain for schach, you want to use for your sukkah. And he says there, the grain does not have any handle. Even though normally grain is used, you want to bundle it up, and you would use part of the straw that's attached to the kernel in order to hold together all the grain and use it to tie it together as a bundle. That would be considered a handle for the grain. Nevertheless, that you're not using this to bundle together. You're using this for schach, and it doesn't have the law of ein lo yodish. It doesn't have the law of handles. And what would end up happening is that you could use the entire grain straw for the schach. The only thing that would not be acceptable for the schach would be the actual kernel. The kernel itself would not be kosher for schach. It would become nullified to the rest of it, and it would be batel, nullified. Now, the Gemara says that what Rabbi Menachem says about this grain, his view is his view, but Reb Abba wouldn't agree with that. Reb Abba would say, when it comes to grain, there are yodos, that is considered a handle, and you do benefit because there is some maybe small benefit, but there is a benefit to have that kernel there. The kernel is benefiting the fact that you want the kernel because it's a little heavy and it holds it down. It holds down the schach. They don't get and so therefore the handle for it is beneficial. And so according to Reb Abba, grain will have something called a handle, which would be considered susceptible to tumah, which basically would mean that if you want to put grain on top of your sukkah for schach, you don't calculate, well, there's 25 inches of straw in 1 inch of kernel, and therefore it's batel. And so I have basically 25 inches of kosher schach, and that's against 1 inch of. I wouldn't be able to do that. I would have to say, well, I have, instead of 25 inches of kosher schach, I would say instead, no, maybe about 16 inches of kosher schach, maybe 3 tfachim, 3 handbreadths or 2. I don't know, however much. It seems to be a discussion about, or questionable, how much of a handle is considered a handle. And brought in Shulchan Aruch the question of that we don't exactly know how much to calculate for a handle, but for many things it's 3 handbreadths. So let's just say for a grain would be 3 handbreadths. It would be like about 9 inches or something. So instead of 25 inches of kosher schach, you've got more like 16 inches of kosher schach versus about 10 inches of a handle and the kernel. And so it's about 16 versus 10. So that would make it kosher. But if you have a smaller grain that doesn't have 16 inches of kosher schach and it only has maybe 9 inches of kosher schach versus 10 inches of non-kosher schach, it would actually ruin your sukkah. or would make at least that area not kosher, or possibly your whole sukkah could be not kosher if you're using this for your entire sukkah. So it would create problems. So this is a machlokes, an argument between Reb Abba and Reb Menachem. Reb Abba would say that there's a problem here. You have yodos, you have an issue of handles. Reb Menachem would say, no, I have 1 little inch of a kernel is my handle, is my non-kosher schach, and everything else is kosher stuff. And what it boils down to is how significant is the grain when it comes to using your straw for schach. You know, how beneficial is it? Is it considered beneficial? Would we consider it to have a handle or not? And that's really what they're arguing about. How beneficial is this? Are we going to consider it important? And the Gemara then says we have a brisa. This brisa touches upon what we're dealing with. The brisa talks about using branches for schach. And the brisa has an argument in the brisa. The first opinion of the brisa just says when you have these branches with fruits at the end, figs or dates or grapes, so you basically have to calculate how big of a amount of grapes it is versus how big of a branch you have. So if you have a majority refuse of the vineyard, meaning stuff that you're not interested in, which is like the branch part, if that's the majority, then it's good for schach. If the majority is the food part of it, the fruits, and so that would mean that it's not good for schach. So you need to know what the majority is. And we don't say anything about a handle. So it sounds like, according to the first opinion, the Tanakama, the first opinion of the Brisa, that we're not concerned about any handles. You're using this for schach purposes. We don't consider any part of those branches to be handles. And it even mentions amongst those cases, those examples, it mentions one of them as kashin, which is the straw for the grain. So it does pick the case that we're dealing with, which is the straw and the grain, and it does not mention anything about having to deal with a handle and the fact that there's maybe a few inches or 9 inches, 3 tfachim maybe, of a part of this grain, a part of the straw that would be considered a handle. It doesn't mention that in first opinion, the Tanakama. He doesn't talk about that. He just says, as long as you have majority of branch or majority of straw versus the kernel, you're all set. Now, Acherim, which is the second opinion in the Brisa, Acherim says that you have to calculate how big of a handle you have and how big of a kernel you have, the food and the handle, versus the rest of it. And if you have a majority of debris or branch, then you're okay for schach. But if you have a majority food plus yodos plus handles, then you're going to have a problem because the handles and the food join together to mess up your sukkah, to ruin the validation of your sukkah. So the Gemara says that these two cases, I mean, it seems like we have an argument, Reb Menachem, Reb Abba, and we have an argument, a Tanakama and Acherim. Seems like that maybe they fit together. Somewhere says that, in other words, one of them says you look at the straw as part of a handle, and the other one says you don't. So does these two arguments, do they fit together? And the Gemara says, well, according to Reb Abba, you have to say that they for sure. Reb Abba says, I can only fit my view where I talked about grapes. I can only follow one of these opinions because I claimed that his case was where you're harvesting for a vineyard, there's no handles. There's no such thing as a handle for wine, for a wine press. You're harvesting grapes for a wine press. There's no such thing as handles. Now, in Reb Abba's case, it made a lot of sense that, you're not going to have any reason to consider that there be any handle there, because it ruins your wine. But what about the other case that he doesn't mention, which means he argues? The other cases that he holds that in the case of grain, you do have a handle. So Reb Abba would hold that in the case of grain, there is a handle, and meaning that he says it's significant, even though maybe you're using it for schach, and nevertheless, there's a benefit that you're having that's not flying around. It has some weight to it. You're going to use that grain afterwards, not going to get lost. So you benefit from having this grain and the kernel and the handle. So let me mute everyone. Yeah. So so Reb Abba holds that there are handles to grain. Which opinion would Reb Abba follow? He would follow the opinion of Acherim that you have to calculate the grain with the handles. The kernel and the handles are there is an issue there that you have to calculate the handles. There's a concept of handles even for this with this straw. And the brisa you could maybe learn two ways. One way is that he's harvesting everything for schach. In the first place, he cut it down for schach purposes. And the other way to learn it is that he cut it down for food purposes, and he's changing his mind and using it for schach purposes. But either way, however you learn, Reb Abba is always going to have a problem with the Tanakama, because Reb Abba holds that even if you cut it down for schach purposes, we have to consider part of the straw to be a handle. Now, what would happen if you cut it down for food purposes, which means that for sure we consider there to be a handle, and then you change your mind that it's for schach? In that scenario, there's no question that Reb Abba would continue with his view. Because even in a case where you cut it only for schach, where there's room to say there's no concept of handles, even there he says there is a concept of handles. So if you cut it down for food, where there's definitely a concept of handles, and then you change your mind, you want to use it for schach, Reb Abba is going to follow the same view that for sure there's a concept of handles there. So there's a handle to this straw, to this kernel of the straw. And therefore, Reb Abba is for sure going to argue on the first opinion, and he will hold like the Acherim. So according to Reb Abba, he has an original source. He has a source from the Tanoic times, Acherim, Meir, that he's going to follow. Reb Abba is going to follow that view. But the Gemara says, but Reb Menachem might be able to say that he fits according to everyone. Why is he going to be able to say that? Because his case is where you cut it down for schach. He could explain the brisa to be talking about where you cut it down for food. Now, when you cut it down for food, then even Reb Menachem could say, well, if you cut it down for food and now you change your mind, in that scenario, you could claim that there are handles. My case was where you cut it down for schach. You cut grain for schach to use for your sukkah. In that scenario, I hold there's no concept of handles. But if you cut it down for purpose of eating, then you already caused there to be a law. You've given it a law of handles already. And now you want to change your mind and say, no, I'm using it for schach. Well, guess what? When you want to change your mind and use it for schach, there's room to say both ways, that maybe it loses its handle status or maybe it doesn't lose its handle status. So Reb Menachem says, all I was talking about was when you cut it down for schach. I'm not dealing with that. That other case, that could be a machlokes. But they both agree with me. Both of those views could agree with me when it comes to cutting it straight for schach purposes. Then everyone agrees that ein lo yodis is no handle law. You want to tell me about a handle law if you cut it down for purpose of eating and then you change your mind? Okay, maybe there's a rule of status of the handle that you could say maybe it doesn't leave it. Okay, so you argue in that case. You can discuss that case. So there's an argument between Acherim and the Tanakam in the case where you cut it down for food purposes, and it already drew on this straw a status of handle, maybe in that case it doesn't get lost when you just change your mind and use it for schach. So there may be, Acherim will say, no, it still has a status of a handle. But the case where you cut it for schach, there's no status of handle. And that's what Reb Menashe had said. Ein lo yodos, there's no concept of handle. And I fit with both of these views. Okay, so that was his way of understanding that brisa. And everyone agrees with me. Reb Menashe is able to claim that I fit with everyone. And the brisa is talking about this specific case, where you cut it initially for food, and then you change your mind for schach. And the truth is, the brisa is vague, because it doesn't say you cut it down for this purpose. It just says you have these branches, and you're using them for schach. It doesn't say you cut it down. See, the case where Reb Menashe spoke about, he talks about hakoitzer, where you were harvesting lischach. He talks very clear. He mentions that I'm cutting it down, I'm harvesting this grain for schach. The case of the brisa, it leaves it a little vague. So there's room for Reb Menashe to say that the case is talking about where you cut it initially, you harvested it for food, and you brought down upon it a status of a handle, and that handle is something that's susceptible to tumah, or causes it to be invalid for schach. And then you want to change your mind and use it for schach, and you want to say, well, maybe I don't need a handle anymore. Not necessarily is that going to work. It's subject to an argument between Acherim and the Tanakama, between the first opinion of the brisa and the second opinion of the brisa. Now, the Gemara gets into now, well, if you want to learn it that way, how does it work with regard to changing the status? We want to say, well, it seems like it's a machlokes, right? You're allowed to change the status with you change your mind to use it for schach. It seems like this is the machlokes. The problem is we have sources that talk about changing the status. And so the Gemara brings these sources. And the Gemara says, what would the reason of the rabbis be that if you change your mind, you want to use it for schach, now it's no longer going to be a handle. He says, oh, so your thoughts can actually make this change? Can they affect the change? Just having a new thought that your new thought that you're using it for schach, it'll invalidate your previous plan of that you already gave it a rule of handles. Can you really say such a thing? We have a Mishnah in Kalim, and that's where we turn to page 14a. And we said the Mishnah in Kalim talks about where you have vessels that have become considered vessels because of your intention. Your intention, the term in the Hebrew is machshava. Your intent causes something to be considered a utensil. What was the case there? So Rashi tells us, let's say, for example, you have a dargesh, which is some type of a couch, a leather couch. So if that's what your plan is, so if you work the leather to make it for this leather couch, it's now going to be susceptible for impurity. However, there's more work that's involved if you want to use the leather for shoes or for straps. It seems like it has to be more soft or something. So you'd have to work the leather even more. So the leather reaches a status of a susceptible to receive impurity if you're using it, if you're going to be making a couch out of it, but it's not yet at that stage of susceptible for impurity if you're using it for shoes, sandals, straps. It's not. It hasn't reached that stage of susceptible. So
what about tefillin?
Yeah, it would be makabel tumah. If it's depends on what your intent is. So if your intent is for this dargesh, which is like a couch, it would now be susceptible for tumah, for impurity. Why? Because of your thought. That was your thought will make it now ready to be susceptible to be makabel tumah, to receive impurity. Why? Because your intent is that I'm using it for this purpose. I've finished my tanning process. There's no more working on this leather that's needed for the purpose that I have in mind. So since my intent is for the couch, it's susceptible to be makabel tumah. However, had I had something else in mind, it would not be susceptible to receive tumah. So that's what the Mishnah in Kalim says, that your thought, all the vessels become tameh, become impure based on your thought, machshava, based on your intent.
Rabbi,
now, yeah,
I have a question. So
yeah.
there's always an issue. People buy these disposable tins and they cook, let's say, chicken in it, right? And then they decide, "Oh, you know what? I'm not going to throw it away. I could use it, a half a dozen more times, whatever."
Right.
And now the question is, if it's disposable, technically it didn't need to be left because it's a disposable. But now that they're using it more,
Yeah.
the problem is, well, now you're using it over and over. So now the question is to be left. But I heard there's an opinion. The rabbi told me that since you're the one who made it more permanent, at this point you were the owner.
Made by a Jew.
You were the owner, and you made it permanent. So therefore, it doesn't need to be left. But this is from the machshava, in other words, right?
Right. There's room to say that. I've heard that as well. I once asked someone, "What happens if you do that on Shabbos? Did you now build a vessel on Shabbos?"
Well,
But that was my question on it. But in any event, there is such a view. I don't remember if that's as Rav Moshe mentioned that, or so, there is such. I've heard that before. That's that's one of the understandings. Well, it is an interesting thing. We have all these disposable. People talk about it with regard to kiddush. Can you make kiddush on a plastic cup? Is it, which many people do because there's no other cups when you go to a kiddush, and they're not giving out silver bechers. But the question is disposable. In other words, it's considered a vessel, except the fact that maybe because it's disposable, maybe it's not considered a vessel. And so something disposable, that would be like, why it might not need to be toiveled because it's disposable. And then, but the question is, so if it's disposable, then maybe you shouldn't be. Maybe if it's not considered a vessel, maybe you shouldn't be allowed to make kiddush on. There's a plastic cup making kiddush. Would that fall into the category of disposable? But then you want to say, well, maybe I'll use it once and then use it again, and then say, oh, it's not disposable anymore. Now I can make kiddush on it. But then you're making it on Shabbos into a vessel. I don't know. I have to ask a competent Rav Pesach about my question about Shabbos. That's not a question for any small.
I'm curious if this whole machshava thing is coming into account. In other words,
no, this would be it's good example. Yes, Jeffrey.
I want to suggest that we be very, very careful with the words we use in English. Machshava, I think in these cases, means a plan. It doesn't mean a thought, just any old thought. It's a plan. Machshavos Hashem are God's plans. Okay?
How about intent? Is intent okay? Intent? How about my word of intent? Is that okay?
Sometimes, I guess, but we have better words. We have kavanah for that. So I would like to say that it's a plan. And that's why it's crucial in these cases.
Okay.
Because the famous phrase is machshavas, meleches machshavas in the Torah, right? If you did something by accident, you leaned on the light switch, it doesn't matter because that was certainly not your intention. But meleches machshavas is something different. So that's what this is. You are designating a particular item to be part of your plan. In one case, the plan is for food. In one case, the plan is for schach. So I think it's better if we think about that we're changing the plan
Okay.
rather than to just say intention.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, we'll make you happy,
Well,
Jeffrey.
the
If
translation
no
I
one
have
is,
here, the translation in is just saying mashava means thought. That's what they're translating.
I really like intent, but if Jeffrey wants me to use the word plan, I'll switch my wording. I like intent better, but okay. Let me just put on the air conditioner. I'll be right back. Okay. All right. So,
Rabbi,
yes.
in Victor's example, does the thing need to be titled now?
Yeah, that was
This
his
metal-
question.
No, this
And
metal
he
thing is
mentioned,
being used over and over again.
no, he mentioned that there's a little like trick that there's a sort of like the fact that you're the one who's changing it from a disposable item to a vessel to a permanent item. So maybe it's considered like a Jew made this vessel because you are now the one making it. If you make a vessel, you're exempt from toiveling. So that was the point that he was sharing with us, that that's one of the discussions.
Yeah, but you're not really making it. You're just the person who's in charge of it during the transition period.
But our Gemara says that your machshava does certain things, and just like it can cause a vessel to be considered a completed item, like for example the couch, you have completed doing the working on the leather to the extent that it's fit for a couch. It is now a recipient because of your intent or your plan to use it for a couch. So your machshava, that causes it to be considered a vessel, a completed vessel. So the same thing would be,
even though you didn't do any action.
well, that's, you did action, but your action is not it doesn't mean much unless your intent is there. Because in other words, your intent is really what's making it into a final product. Because if not for your intent, then your action is meaningless, because you still need to do more working on the leather in order to make it susceptible for shoes, in order to make it complete for shoes. But the fact that your intent is that it's good for a couch, that you're using it for a couch, that means that it's that your thought, your decision to use it for a couch is basically what makes it a vessel now. So the same thing would, yeah.
But if your intent is there and you didn't do any action at all, it's only intent. It's no action at all. And
that's interesting. It is interesting. How do we look at this? Is, do we consider this, the term the Mishnah uses is it becomes susceptible for tumah with your machshava, with your intent, which implies like it really is not the action that's doing it. It's the fact that your intent is for the couch. That's what does it. So,
but with the word with implies it's with something else. But if that's the only thing, what's it with? The machshava is without any action.
You could just say through, not with.
Oh,
the machshava would be through your intent. So that's what it says, and it says ve'ein oilen mitomasan ela b'shinoi ma'isa, but it would only leave its susceptibility for impurity if you do a change of action. So, for example, if you want to now make it into shoes, you would need to do some action in order to do that. And one of the ways, one of the ways to do that would be to stick a knife into it and cut it into, into the type of, you'd start cutting it in the measurements that are beneficial for shoes. So, the Gemara says, the Mishnah says that Maisa is moitzi miyad Maisa, umiyad machshava. This is like the general rule, it says in that Mishnah, that Maisa, an action, will take out from an action, and an action will take out from a plan or an intent. But machshava, but thought, will not take away something that's already, an action was done with it, and it won't take away something that had machshava, an intent already. So, or plan, it won't remove it. And so that Mishnah is being used here by our Gemara to prove that the case where you harvested wheat for the purpose of eating, and the concept of yodais, the rule, the status of a handle, has taken effect on the let's say 3 hand breadths of that are next to the kernel of this grain, and they fall into a status of a handle. That status of a handle, when you change your mind and you want to use it for schach purposes, that status of the handle will not change, because it fell upon it through thought, but it does not stay on it. It does not change it when you have a thought. You need to use an action in order to change it. And based on that, the Gemara's understanding that we can't explain Reb Menachem to fit with the opinion of Acherim. Acherim said that there is a concept of this. In other words, Acherim said that when you start one second. We can't explain that opinion according to the rabbis. That's the problem. We can't explain that opinion according to the rabbis, because, in other words, if once it has the status of a yad, it can't go off. And here we're trying to claim that the story is you started with a thought to make it for food, and then you're changing your mind and using it for schach. It's not going to leave it. So we really need to explain that whole brisa to be talking about a simple case where you only planned on schach, and that's what you're continuing to use it for, and you didn't change your mind, because changing your mind is not going to change the status. That's basically what the Gemara is saying.
But so, isn't that what that's what I was trying to say before, that you needed an action? Now you're telling me that you do need an action. Without an action,
difference. Yeah, there's to cause it to fall into one status, or to take it away from some status. To bring it into a certain status, a thought can do it. But to take it out of that status, that's where the Gemara is understanding from this Mishnah in Kalim, that you won't be able to take it out of a status unless you have an action. If you look at the wording, it fits very well. Look at the wording here on page 14a, specifically you, David. Take a look at the wording here. The second line on the Gemara, Maisa moitzi miyad, Maisa umiyad machshava. An action takes out from something that got its status from a Maisa, or got its status from a machshava. That means machshava could give it a status, and a Maisa could take it out of that status. An action can take it out of the status that it got. How did it get the status? It got it either through a Maisa or through a machshava. That a machshava could give it its status in the first place, but a Maisa would be needed to take it out of its status. Now machshava, a thought, an intent, a plan, that is Eina Maitzi Alay Miyad Maisa V'Alay Miyad Machshava, but a thought can't take it out of a status. It doesn't say anything about giving it a status, because it can give a status, but it can't take it out of its status. You see that, David?
Yeah.
Okay, so that's basically it. Okay, so the Gemara says that that you might be able to knock off this whole discussion. It says maybe you'll say that that this only applies to vessels themselves, but to the handle of a vessel, for a handle of a food, a handle for a food, that this applies to vessels, but for a handle of a food, which it itself is like a quasi type of susceptibility to tumah, to impurity. So for the handle of food, it's only it's simply for the purpose of food. Even a thought maybe could take it out of its status. And maybe in this scenario, you could say that, this is a topic of discussion of the brisa, that maybe the thought would be able to take it out of its status, and that's maybe the opinion of the rabbis. Normally, you're right. Normally, a vessel that doesn't work for. And in fact, if you look at that Mishnah in Kalim, it talks about the Kalim. Kalim yarden li de tumah machshava vein oilin. It talks about Kalim. So when you talk about yodos of food, it's l'tzorech achila. It emphasizes we're dealing with the handle for food. Here, maybe it might be of a lighter rules, might have lesser severity. Might not be as intense. And so the Gemara says maybe you want to say that, and then the Gemara brings a Mishnah in Uktzin. And this Mishnah talks about yados of food. The only thing is, the Mishnah in Uktzin uses a word that's unclear what it means. And that word is called bisasan. Now, we know that word from Pesach, the Seder, misbaiseses bidomayach, or from a bris, right? Wallowing in the bloods.
Sfirat Omer, I think we say it also. So.
Maybe.
Well, it's the same pasuk in in the L'Shem Yichud before.
In the L'Shem Yichud. Okay, I don't say the L'Shem Yichud. Very nice that so I'm not familiar with it. But yes, it's definitely a minhag to say it. So the word besasan is a little vague. One way of understanding besasan is that you untied it. The other way is to understand it that you smashed it or threshed it. And based on these two translations, it's going to create a difference of how we're gonna learn this. So the Gemara goes through those two interpretations. So let's talk about this Mishnah here. The Gemara wants to prove that when you have a yodos, the handle for a food, it would there's a reason to say that it's going to fall into the same category of a vessel. What does the Mishnah say? The Mishnah says all the handles of food that you were besasan begoyren, that you did this act of besasan. Again, we're not translating it yet because the Gemara will translate it for us shortly. But you did some besasan. You either did what would be called an act, an action, or you did a thought. But one of those things you did with this food, this grain. So the law is tahiros. The handle is no longer impure or susceptible to impurity, and it's not going to bring impurity to the food. It's tahor, it's pure. Because whatever basisa means, the basisa removes the status of handles. Now, the Gemara goes through. Now, so what is basasan? If basasan just means you untied it, that would mean that what you're basically saying is you no longer are interested in having this bundle, and the purpose of the handle would be for a bundle. And if you untied it, you're showing that your intent is no longer for a handle. You don't care for the handle, and so by untying it, it would be very similar to the case of schach, where you initially were using it for food, and now you want to use it for schach, and so it had a status of a handle, and then you changed your mind. It's like you untied the bundle, which also shows that your intent is no longer there for a bundle. You don't care for the handle. So in that case, we could say that, you know, the law of handles are a little more lenient than the laws of vessels. That handles, you're right, you change your mind. It's okay it actually changes the status. However, and this is the main point, if besasan means that besasan mamish, you actually threshed this grain, this wheat, and you threshed it, you had the animals walk on it, or you use some type of instrument to weaken it and loosen it, and you can't tie it anymore. You did some action that it no longer, so because you did this action that it no longer can be tied together, and you did an action that proves that your action is an action that proves it, that is why it no longer is able to be a bundle, a handle. It no longer has a status of a handle because of your action. So if you learn it that way, it means that handles are the same law as vessels. And that basically takes us back to the previous conclusion that we were constantly getting at, and that is that we can't learn like we tried to. We can't learn that Reb Menashe can fit with everyone. It ultimately will lead us back to say that Reb Menashe, his case has to be, the way he learns the brisa is going to have to be that you actually harvested this wheat in order for schach in the first place. And even then, there seems to be an argument if there's a concept of yodois handles or not, because there is a small benefit of having a handle. It's not so significant, maybe, so there's room to say both ways. And Reb Menashe holds one way, that there's no law of handles, but the other opinion would argue with Reb Menashe. Reb Menashe would argue on the other opinion, and the other opinion, Aterim, holds there is handles. And so it ultimately will end up that Reb Abba and Reb Menashe are arguing about the same argument about these two earlier rabbis. And that's what would come out from this. And that's where we're up to, actually, in the Gemara. So now we got to jump into the Gemara now. And so let me tell you where we're going to start. We're on page 14a. First wide line. We're going to start at the Hacha Nami. Hacha Nami. It's the Rabbi? First, yeah. I don't have the art scroll open in front of me, so I don't know what page it is in the art scroll, but somewhere on 14a, probably 14a1 or 14a2. Yes, Moshe.
Threshing the wheat no longer makes it no longer makes it a handle, and therefore can be used for schach. But the problem with threshing, though, is that when you thresh some wheat, it's more prone to moisture and absorption, because the wheat has been damaged. And if you're talking about animals,
our issue is we're only dealing with, did you do an action that the action will remove the concept of a handle from this? In other words, that you no longer are going to be able to tie it together. And since your action is causing that it can't be tied together, your action is able to remove the status of a handle from it. That's all we're getting at. There might be other benefits or problems with it, but the main point that we're getting at is not about the, and any other issues. It's all about, have you done an action that has removed the status of a handle? And the answer is yes. So if besasan means you've actually done a major action and you've removed its ability to be tied together, so that would be or the action removing its earlier status. Now, if you're going to learn that way, then what would be in the case of schach, where you just changed your mind? You didn't do an action. Gemara's understanding, well, then it doesn't lose its status of a handle. If you just changed your mind, that's not going to change. That's not going to change anything. So the Gemara now says, okay, how about we're going to learn the brisa the same way we wanted to, what you would say, like be kvetch into the brisa a different shot, but we're going to add one more little knetch, one more little bend. We're going to add one more knetch to it. What is that? Let's say the brisa is talking as we tried to push this shot, this explanation in the brisa. Let's continue with what we're trying to do. We're trying to say the brisa is talking about a case where you initially harvested it for food, and then you changed your mind. But not only did you change your mind, you actually were besasan mamish. That you also in the brisa is the case where you actually threshed it, and you had an animal walk on it, who knows what. And in that case, you're using it you're going to now use it for schach, and you no longer are going to be using a handle. So even though you initially used it for a handle in the first place, you initially harvested for food and you wanted to have a handle for it, but now that you're besasan mamish, that you actually are threshing it, here, maybe also you've now ruined the handle, that it's no longer going to be a handle. And now maybe there's room to say that the status of a handle goes away. But the Gemara says, oh, yeah, for sure there is. You ruined the handle. Why would the other opinion say there is a status of a handle? If so what's the other opinion? How are you going to say the other opinion that Acherim says there still is the concept of handle? You even used the Maisa. You ruined the handle. You did an action. So why would the others say that there is still a status of a handle? If you did an action, and we have a Mishnah that even says Kalim, if you use an action, you remove the earlier status with an action. So here you did an action. So the Gemara answers, the Amor to Rabbi Yossi, that this Acherim holds like Rabbi Yossi, which argues on that Mishnah, where it says Kol Yodos, that it argues on the Mishnah Nuktzin. He says over there, the Tanan for Rabbi Yossi Metame, that Rabbi Yossi holds that even after your basisa, it still has the din of yadois, still is considered a yad, and it's going to bring the impurity to the food if the handle still considered a handle, and even after you did basisa, you still it doesn't change the status, and it'll still be susceptible to tuma, and that would be the reason of a cherim, that even after you did basisa and you threshed it, it would still be considered a handle. So the Gemara says, "Hi mai, how could you compare the two? Bishlem mahasam over there, after you did this basisa, it's on the threshing floor, and you could say that maybe he's still you didn't ruin the handle. Taima de Bishlem mahasam, it's good over there. Taima de Rabbi Yossi, the reason why it doesn't remove the status, because Chazia look at Reb Shimon ben Lakish, because it's still fit these handles for what Reb Shimon ben Lakish says. He's normally abbreviated as Reish Lakish, Reb Shimon ben Lakish. Dama Reb Shimon ben Lakish, because Reb Shimon ben Lakish says that Hayil v'reuyos lahifchan be'eser, that the reason why it's still considered a handle is because you're able to turn them over with a pitchfork. And if it didn't have this handle on it, in other words, if these kernels didn't have the little piece attached, if it still wasn't attached to some straw, then it would fall. And it's good that it's attached to something. There's some straw attached to these kernels, and it's able to you're able to use this fork to turn them over. And however, whatever the benefit of however they would do it with the in the grain in this threshing floor. Now that causes it to be considered. That causes it to be considered a still a handle, because you still want it. You still want it to be to be attached. You still so you're benefiting from it. And the reason you thresh this was in order to like loosen it. Elahacha, but here, in a case where you're harvesting and you harvested it to eat, and now you change it and using it for schach, lemay chozya, what benefit would there be after you threshed it and you were besasan, which we're translating as you did this action, to ruin to sort of like make it it's not going to be able to be tied together anymore. So why would it still have a handle status? So the Gemara answers, chazia, it would be fit. It would fit l'chisasar leminkat. It would fit l'chisasar leminkat lehu begilayhu. It'll fit to that when you take down your sukkah, that it'll you'll be able to hold these straw stalks easier. So the minkat lahu bigilayhu, they'll be able to be handled. You'll be able to hold on to them, and you won't have to hold on to this straw, the kernel itself. You could hold on to these stalks. So there is a benefit, and therefore it would still be considered a handle. So that's basically this is the Gemara, the conclusion of this Gemara, that the Gemara concludes that the Brisa could be talking about a case of you harvested the grain in order to eat. It fell on it the status of a handle. Part of the straw is considered a handle, and that status stays on according to Acherim even after you were besasan, even after you threshed it. That status stays on because there's some benefit to have that, and it will ultimately be a machlokes of Acherim and the other opinion if it's considered, even though you did an action to remove the status, you did an action which theoretically could remove the status of yadis of a handle. Not necessarily does it remove it, because there is some small benefit that you're able to hold it by the pieces that are attached to it.
Rabbi,
so according to Acherim, that would be considered a handle, and ultimately Reb Menachem could say, everyone agrees with me, if you harvested it for schach purposes, then there's no such thing as a handle. But if you harvested it for food, it already fell on it the status of a handle, then there could be an argument if that status leaves it, and if your action of besisa, if that removes it or not. But basically, Reb Menachem can say, I fit like everyone in the Brisa, and Reb Abba can say, I only fit like one of the opinions of the Brisa. And that's the conclusion of this little piece of Gemara. Okay, Moshe, yes.
So I'm trying to understand this. It's like an adhesion from threshing it. The grain becomes almost like stuck together, and it acts like a handle. Is that what we're saying here? I'm trying to understand.
No, it seems like the pieces of the grain are still attached somewhat. They're attached to the kernel, and even though some of it broke off or whatever, but there's still some pieces attached. And it may be looser, but it's attached to it, and it's beneficial if you want to lift it up. You don't have to find the individual kernel. You could use like you have a handle now to find it. It's easier to lift up, something along those lines. Again, because we're not so into the farming, sometimes it is hard to try to imagine, but that's my understanding of this story. Okay, have a wonderful day, everyone. Sei gesund.
Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you, Rabbi.
Victor.
Thank you.